Hi, everyone. This is Jason Briacco of Wall Street for Main Street. Welcome back to another Wall Street for Main Street podcast interview. Today's special guest is a first-time guest. Been noticing his work recently. He has a new book out called The Problem with Socialism. He's a professor at Loyola University, Maryland. He's an Austrian school economist, and he's written many books, including The Real Lincoln, Lincoln Unmasked, How Capitalism Saved America, Hamilton's Curse, and Organized Crime, The Unvarnished Truth About Government. Thomas DiLorenzo, thank you for joining me.
I'm pleased to be with you, Jason.
Now, Thomas, I want to ask you about your definition of socialism, because a lot of my listeners, they argue with me all the time that, oh, you're not using the correct definition of socialism. What's your definition of it?
Well, it's not my definition. It originally started out as meaning government ownership of the means of production. But I also quote Friedrich Hayek from The Road to Serfdom, saying that by the 70s, it had evolved to include income redistribution through the welfare state and a progressive income tax. And I also include a statement from a book called Socialism by Ludwig von Mises, where he said that the tactic of socialists has always included what he called destructionism, that is an attempt to destroy the private property, free enterprise society with onerous taxes, regulations, inflation, whatever works. So it's government ownership, and we've got plenty of islands of socialism all over our economy. The welfare state, progressive income tax, and punitive regulation and taxation.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Now, I think, a lot of people would still, I think they just repeat the textbook definition of socialism and they say, oh, what we have right now is not real socialism because they don't want to own the means of production. But I would argue, and I think what you've mentioned is Hayek and Mises would also argue that the socialists have adapted. So it seems to me that they're okay with this compromise of fascism and increasing inflation and increasing taxation and all the other things that they've layered on to screw over the private sector.
Oh, yes. Well, Hayek mentioned that the ostensible goal of socialists has always been redistribution or egalitarianism. And so the tactics have evolved. The tactic was first take over industry, and that proved to be a disaster because politicians generally don't know anything about how to run a business, and then but they like to redistribute income because it props up their political power, and so they employed the welfare state and a progressive income tax, and of course the progressive income tax was the second point or the second plank of the Communist Manifesto, right next to abolition of private property, and Marx and Engels included that because placed it second because they understood that it would destabilize a private enterprise economy.
Yeah, I want to add to your point there. Ayn Rand has a great quote for our listeners out there. She says that there is no difference between communism and socialism except in the means of achieving the same ultimate end. Communism proposes to enslave men by force, socialism by vote. It is merely the difference between murder and suicide.
Yeah, that's a pretty accurate quote, but I would argue that voting is also coercive. After all, if we were to vote ourselves a socialist government, elect Bernie Sanders president, those of us who voted no can't object. We can't not pay income tax. The government will put you in a cage for 7 or 8 years if you do that, and that's not voluntary. That's coercive. And so socialism is socialism. Obamacare is socialized medicine, whether it's imposed on us by a dictator or by a majority rule vote in a democracy. It still has the same effect.
Yeah, those are great points. I was actually going to ask you how pervasive is socialism in the U.S. because there's just so many people defending it that, with the old textbook definition. Do you think socialism then is just so pervasive? It's in our culture, it's in our media. Do you think it's in basically every industry now?
Well, not so much industry. It's all the rotten parts of our economy. The inner cities are islands of rotten socialism with government-run schools, huge welfare states, big government, high taxes, government police, government everything, and look at them. They're the worst, most crime-filled parts of our country. We've got, the public schools work pretty well in some of the affluent suburbs because parents are affluent enough to send their kids to private school if they wanted to. And that little bit of competitive pressure forces the public schools or the government schools to shape up and perform a little better. But that's absent in the inner cities where incomes tend to be lower, and which is why it is grossly discriminatory against African Americans, because there are large African American populations in the inner cities where the worst schools are. And so we've got islands of socialism in the cities. And if you look at federal, state, and local government taxes, they amount to about more than 35%, close to 40% of all national income. So I would argue that if you add on top of that 75,000 pages of federal regulation, that about half our economy is socialist.
Yeah, and the tax code just keeps getting layered on more and more. There's just more bureaucracy. So, I mean, I think, there's not a huge difference between fascism and communism and socialism and Marxism. I think, a lot of these ideologies that were hardcore leftist, I think, they've adapted to more fascism. But, I get in debates with a lot of even libertarian people who say that, fascism isn't nearly as bad as all the others. But I think, fascism is the compromise that I think Marx would be very happy with a lot of the fascism that's been implemented right now.
Well, one of the chapters of my book is entitled The Socialist Roots of Fascism. And I don't consider fascism to be anything but a form of socialism, along with communism. It's all the same gang. After all, the word Nazi stood for National Socialism. The German fascists distinguished themselves from the Russians by calling themselves National Socialists, whereas the Russians called themselves International Socialists. And let's not forget that the Russian communists, as we call them, they called them their own government, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. They didn't call it the Union of Soviet Communist Republics. Communism was the utopian ideal that was never achieved in their eyes. But in the meanwhile, it was a socialist empire by their own language.
Now, Thomas, do you think central banking is socialist?
Well, sure it is. It's a government-run banking system. It was also one of the planks of the Communist Manifesto and of the German Nazi Party 25-point plank of 1925 that you can look up on the web. Socialists have always understood that it's important to socialize capital markets as much as possible. The one thing that makes capitalism more than anything else is capital markets, the flow of capital from lower valued to higher valued uses as determined by consumers only can work if you have private capital markets. And so the Fed or the central bank doesn't totally nationalize capital markets, but it goes a long way toward allocating a great deal of capital by government means as opposed to private means. And the private means, by the way, are always guided by consumers. The consumers are always the bottom line. If you don't please them, you don't make money. And so any business that borrows money, takes on a lot of debt from a bank, has to please the consumers to pay off that debt.
Yeah, I have a good quote here from Will Spencer. Under capitalism, man tries to exploit man using voluntary exchange. Under socialism, man exploits man using government force.
Yeah, that's a famous old quote, but I wouldn't argue that man exploits man under capitalism. Capitalism is mutually advantageous. When Adam Smith, in his famous book, The Wealth of Nations, put it the right way when he said basically what capitalism is give me that which I want, and I will give you that which you want. After all, when you buy something, it's a positive sum game. You give me money, and I give you my good or my service, and we're both better off as we see it. And so it's not coercive at all. It's voluntary. Crime is coercive. If I hold a gun to your head, now that's involuntary. That's coercive. But government is always coercive because it's always based with a threat of imprisonment if you don't pay taxes.
Yeah, exactly. Or comply with this regulation, or there's just so many other rules and regulations and red tape that it seems government's been coming out with. That we mentioned earlier in the interview, the tax code. The tax code is just getting ridiculous to comply with. There's so many. I think there's over 2 million words in the tax code and over 70,000 pages.
Yeah, I think I read somewhere where more than 70% of the IRS agents routinely fail a pretty simple, straightforward test on the tax code.
Well, welcome to dystopia. I'm not surprised about that. Now, I want to ask you about Democrat socialist countries. My listener base is all over the world. We have listeners in Canada, listeners in Germany, listeners in Europe, and they defend their European socialist countries either in Scandinavia or Germany or Canada. They call it a success. But when I look at these countries now, especially Germany and ones in Europe, I see immigration problems. I see their economy is in peril. So I don't see the success that they're claiming as much. But why do you think, the socialists like Bernie Sanders always point to these small Scandinavian countries talking about how much of a success it is?
It's because they know that the average American knows nothing about it, and he can pull the wool over their eyes. You take the example of Sweden, for example. Sweden was a very limited government, low tax, high economic freedom country in the late 19th, early 20th century. And they had all these great entrepreneurs like Alfred Nobel, who invented dynamite, the people who created Volvo and Saab automobiles. And they had the highest per capita income growth beginning in 1870 for about 60 years. And then they adopted they toyed with fascism, and then they adopted their version of socialism by nationalizing a lot of industries, adopting a big welfare state and a heavily progressive income tax and heavy regulation of what was left of private industry. And as a result, Sweden did not create a single net new job for 55 years, from 1950 until 2005, according to the Swedish Economic Association. And meanwhile, they tried to bail themselves out by printing money in the 80s, and they created 500% interest rates as a result. And so they had a bit of a revolt, a sort of a Margaret Thatcher style revolt, where they privatized some industries, deregulated banking and telecommunications and some other industries, and cut their marginal tax rates. And so politicians like Bernie Sanders, who point to Sweden as a model for us, are lying. They're simply lying to us. And I traveled throughout Europe, and basically everything I see is the standard of living is not nearly as high as the average standard of living here in America. Their hotels are not as nice, their homes are not as nice, their yards are not as big, not as nice, and it's just the standard of living is just not as good. And so I think people like Sanders and Hillary Clinton take advantage of what we economists call rational ignorance. The average member of the public spends most of his or her time educating themselves about how to do their jobs, how to raise their families, and we don't really pay much attention to that much about politics, especially international politics.
I think the GDP, I'm not sure if it's of Sweden, but it's of one of the Scandinavian countries, is only of the size of Mississippi, which is one of the smallest, lowest GDPs of any state in the United States. So, I mean, these are small. One thing that Bernie Sanders or Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama, any of these guys that wants European socialism in the United States won't point out is how small these other countries are compared to the United States. So to try to turn the United States, into a full European social democracy, it's going to make things immensely worse in the real economy for people on Main Street.
Yes, well, Sweden has not been involved in a war since the year 1809, too. And so that makes a big difference in terms of your ability to have a higher standard of living.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point you also brought up about the lack of jobs creation. One thing I've also read about articles, and I've heard, some people who have woken up and become libertarian who are from Scandinavian countries, they tell me a lot of people in Europe are happy with very, very little. I guess they're used to high prices and not getting much bang for their buck. Their purchasing power is almost always stolen with either higher taxes or higher inflation, and they're not even aware of this. And then, they get like some type of government subsidy or check from the government, and, they have a part-time job, but they go out on the weekends partying and go to soccer, and, they have government paid vacations and things like that. So I guess when they get a few of these perks, they're just not aware of how they're being screwed over and stolen from.
It was sort of like during communism, they used to talk about demonstration effects. The communists did everything they could to avoid letting their people know how people in America lived, because if they found out, they would know that they were being plundered by their own government. And so, I guess if you want to have a society of welfare parasites, then that's your business. And but those of us in America know better, and people like myself prefer not to live in a society of welfare parasites, and living in freeloaders. Denmark. I cite a Danish economist in my book who says that the total tax take, if you add it up, is around 70%. And so just think how happy people, the Danes, would be if the government took 95%. And your friends, the people you debate, Jason, who point to this as something that we should emulate, you might suggest to them that they start sending 70% of all their income to Washington, D.C., and make themselves infinitely happier. They could, just like Denmark.
Yeah, I think they would be like the hypocritical Democratic politicians here in the United States. A lot of these Democrat politicians in the U.S., they go on MSNBC or CNN or these other mainstream news networks, and they talk about how they want everyone to pay higher taxes and the billionaires to pay higher taxes. But then they're hypocrites like Bernie Sanders, where they make over $200,000 and they only pay 13% income taxes. When the average guy on Main Street who's making $200,000, he's going to pay 40-50% taxes. So these guys are just total hypocrites. The laws that they would come out with just wouldn't apply to them.
Yeah, they're control freaks. They're the worst kind of control freaks. They want to control entire countries. My friend Judge Andrew Napolitano introduced a Latin phrase to me, libido dominandi. It means the lust to dominate other people. And it was used in the Roman Empire. So this is a very old term. And there's just a segment of just about every country's population that has this compulsion to order other people around, to be in charge, to use the coercive powers of government to order them around. And I think that's what motivates people like Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, in addition to becoming fabulously wealthy like Hillary Clinton has. I just read an article from the New York Times about how her daughter, who has never even had a real job, lives in a $10 million apartment in New York City.
Yeah, and she's also getting paid like a $400,000 or $500,000 a year salary as a consultant for one of the news channels, and I don't even think she does any work. She had like a TV show for a short amount of time, and then it got canceled, but they still pay her a consulting fee. I mean, everything's, a kickback to the Clinton Foundation slush fund. I actually had Charles Ortel on about a month ago on our channel, and he said over $100 billion since 1997 has gone in and out of the Clinton Foundation for bribes and things like that.
Bernie Madoff would be very envious.
Now, I want to ask you about your article that you put up on Lou Rockwell a couple weeks ago. You're talking about millennials and how they prefer socialism to capitalism. Why do you think that is? Do you think they're brainwashed? Do you think they don't want to get a job? My generation, I was born in 1982. I guess you could call me a millennial. I think I'm more of a Generation Xer. But, now that I've had to work jobs and I've seen the money that the government has taken out of my paycheck, with Social Security tax and payroll tax, it's like 35% right off the top that I don't even see.
Well, yeah, I quoted a Pew Foundation poll that said 69% of voters under 30 could vote for a socialist for president. Part of it is economic ignorance, lack of economic education and understanding of socialism versus markets and competition. And another part of it is the never-ending appeal to envy by politicians like Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, and also the demonization of markets. And after the crash of '08, caused by the Fed primarily, most of the academic world and the media all blamed it on markets when it was government that was responsible for the crash. The Fed created yet another boom and bust cycle that busted in '08. And so the millennials have had this constant drumbeat demonizing markets, and at the same time they have this kindly old grandfather looking guy who plays Santa Claus and offers them something for nothing: free food, free education, free healthcare, and they kind of like that. And I think that's why a lot of the millennials say they would like socialism. But all they have to do really is read the articles on the web today about democratic socialist Venezuela that has imploded. They adopted socialism in 1999, and middle-class people who used to have good jobs are now today rooting through garbage in the streets looking for food to eat, and they've got hyperinflation on top of that.
Yeah, that's a great point. I actually wanted to speak to you about Venezuela a little later in the interview. I want to keep talking about young people, though. I think they have been brainwashed by their textbooks, their professors throughout their entire educational system. Thomas Woods talks about this in his books and speeches about how, the odds are against someone becoming a libertarian because of how much conditioning they have from the school system, from the mainstream media, whether it's cultural Marxism or they're learning, direct Marxist philosophy in school that business and profits are bad, or Keynesian economics in school. It's just really difficult to overcome. I mean, I can't, for a lot of my friends out there who aren't libertarian, for me to even show them the Clinton Cash documentary, just to get them to show them that how corrupt Hillary Clinton is, they won't even look at 5 minutes of the documentary. Their mind is made up because they didn't see the articles in the Washington Post or the New York Times or the key websites that they look at.
Yeah, brainwashing works. I think that's the problem. That's why I wrote this book, The Problem with Socialism. It's written very easy to understand language. And even though there are several hundred footnotes in it, it's still easy to understand. There's 16 chapters that cover all aspects of socialism. And I'm hoping to reach out to a lot of the millennials. I know my own students, I'm still an economics professor. Some of them are Bernie Sanders supporters last semester. And I just say things to them like, I don't work for free. I'm not a slave, and neither does anyone else here at the university. So how could it be that education could ever be free? Somebody has to pay for this. And a lot of them look at me as though they had never thought of that before. And then they start to turn around, especially after I show them the debt clock on the internet. That's just this clock that lists the national debt, and it moves at about 10,000 miles an hour, adding dollar after dollar, every split second. And they understand that it's on them. It's their debt. It's their tax burden for the rest of their lives. And so some of them turn around and begin resenting the fact that politicians are playing them for fools by offering them something for nothing.
Yeah,
the government is not Santa Claus.
Yeah, I agree. And this goes back to, Economics on One Lesson and stuff that Henry Hazlitt and also before him Bastiat wrote about, the seen and the unseen. So in economics, there's no such thing as a free lunch. When a politician promises, whether it's George W. Bush to get elected, promising everyone Medicare Part D, which no one could pay for, or, Obamacare, which is like basically a Ponzi scheme for my generation, the millennials. We're going to have to work our butts off to pay for the baby boomer generation, their medical bills, and Social Security and things like this. These are things people want the benefits. They'll give the politician the vote, and they don't care in a lot of cases who fits the bill for it.
That's exactly right.
Now, Thomas, I want to ask you about Venezuela a lot. I think that's really important. Obviously, I think the U.S. has more capital here. There's more infrastructure. We have the world's reserve currency. So I don't think the U.S. is going to be collapsing like Venezuela tomorrow or anything like that. But that doesn't mean that we aren't seeing things go down that path towards either, Venezuela or other countries that are in peril. Do you think Venezuela could be fixed, or do you think it's going to have to totally collapse first?
Oh, well, yeah, it could be fixed. You could take a lesson to what happened in post-war Germany. After the war was over, the American authorities who ran Germany, West Germany, after the war, kind of like the Nazi economic controls, because the Nazi economic controls were almost identical to the New Deal. And so they kept them in. And it was Ludwig Erhard, the German finance minister, who went on the radio on a Sunday and just announced that no more price controls, no more government-controlled prices. Prices are to be controlled by the free market, supply and demand. And the economy turned around almost overnight. Within weeks, the shelves were full of products and goods, and it was profitable once again to be a business person in Germany, and that's what jump-started the great German economic recovery after the war. And Venezuela is not nearly as devastated as Berlin was in 1946. It was a bombed-out shell, and so yes, it's possible. But but historically, what usually has to happen is some sort of catastrophe before the public wakes up out of its slumber. And they are having a catastrophe in democratic socialist Venezuela today. Hundreds of thousands of people have left the country literally looking for food. And the latest outrage in Venezuela is that the government now says it wants to force people to work on the farms for at least 60 days to produce food to avert starvation. Forced labor. Slavery for at least 60 days on the farm. The Soviets did that. The Soviets made people who had other jobs, whether it's a bus driver or a school teacher or whatever, get on a train and go out and pick potatoes somewhere during the harvest time. And that's what they're doing in Venezuela, the same thing that the totalitarian Soviets did during the Soviet Empire.
Yeah, famine seems very common in these totalitarian dictatorships that are either communist or hardcore socialism. I read a book actually about this girl who escaped North Korea called 1,000 Miles to Freedom, and her father actually died of starvation. And, her and her sister and her mother almost died as well, escaping, going to China and then getting, deported back. So I think it's a common theme there. Venezuela just has so many shortages that the free market could easily fix. Obviously, there's a black market now, but if you get caught, I guess, money changing and caught with too many US dollars, you can go to prison. I've seen pictures of guys going to prison for smuggling baby food and other, key staples into the country.
Yes, these people are heroes. They're heroes. They're smuggling baby food to give babies food to avert starvation, and the government puts them in jail. Our government did that after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. They said, we are in charge of the recovery. And so you may remember hearing about the stories of private individuals renting tractor-trailer trucks full of water and other supplies and driving them from New Jersey to New Orleans. And the Department of Homeland Security would stop them on the highway and make them turn around and go back. That's that was our country. That wasn't third world Venezuela.
Yeah, well, there's just so many tendencies by a lot of the bureaucrats in power. I mean, a lot of people think that the election right now could really change things, whether if Trump actually wins. But what I tell people is that, the bureaucrats run the country now in the United States, and that even when Reagan was president and he tried to defund so many government agencies, and yes, he created the war on drugs and he created other agencies, but he did try to actually defund some government agencies. The bureaucrats just waited him out for 8 years, and it was right back to business as normal. So I think, even if Trump wins in this situation, the bureaucrats who do have socialist tendencies, a lot of them are hardcore Keynesians or even a hardcore socialists, some of them even Marxists. I think, they will be back to more inflation, more taxes, more rules, more regulations. I just see things getting worse, whether it's Venezuela or in the United States, before they get better right now.
All the same people who demonize him day in and day out will do everything they can to sabotage him if he wins. And that's why, by the way, I think the only real way out to return America to some semblance of a free society is secession and nullification. Thomas Jefferson himself, before he died, thought that the United States would be broken up into several different confederacies. And he said they will all be Americans and we would wish them all well. That was his attitude towards secession late in his life. And of course, nullification was something that Americans adopted during Jefferson's time and right up through the Civil War. North and South states nullified laws that they thought were unconstitutional, federal laws. And I think that's one thing we have to start thinking about if we want to think seriously about a free society, because the Leviathan bureaucracy is just out of control and too big to control.
Yeah, I agree. And if there's another economic crisis, like a stock market crash, like 2008 or worse, I think they're just going to keep building in new government agencies with thousands of new government employees. The thing is, though, there was 10 government agencies, Thomas, during the 2008 housing crisis, and none of them was able to stop the housing crisis. So why do we need more government agencies?
A lot of those government agencies were responsible for the housing crisis. Fannie Mae and Ginnie Mae were the Congress ordered the banking system basically to make bad loans to unqualified borrowers because they wanted to increase the home ownership rate. And then they got Fannie Mae and Ginnie Mae to securitize all these bad loans and pretend that they were actually valuable assets. And with sort of the implicit guarantee that they, Fannie Mae and Ginnie Mae, would be bailed out, which they were to the tune of tens of billions of dollars.
Yeah, I agree. A lot of people who aren't as informed as you or I, they will blame capitalism and free markets and the banks and say that the banks were unregulated, but the banks were actually very regulated. It's just the regulators either didn't care or they weren't paying attention that much, or in a lot of cases, the regulators didn't want to piss off the big banks because they wanted to go get a job at the big banks, in their compliance department for 10 times the salary they're making as a regulator.
Yes, there's a long history in America and elsewhere of what economists call regulation for the regulated. There's even a theory called the capture theory of regulation that, and there's a lot of research on it about how big corporations mostly inevitably capture regulatory agencies so that they are run for their benefit, not for the benefit of consumers. So it's very naive to think that Mother Teresa or Jesus Christ will be in charge of regulatory agencies and do the right thing and protect the public. They're going to protect themselves, and that often means being in bed with the corporations that they're supposed to be regulating.
Yeah, I think the consumer out there, it's caveat emptor. They have to protect themselves. The people who are expecting government to go in there and solve all their problems or protect them all the time, it's just not going to happen. And if we hire, tens of thousands of new government bureaucrats and print off trillions of dollars to give the government more money and power to quote unquote fix things, I think it's just going to end up making things worse. The cure, the quote unquote cure, is going to be worse than the disease itself.
Yeah, well said.
Well, Thomas, I want to ask you about Keynes before we go. Would you classify then Keynes as a socialist, a fascist? Was he picking and choosing parts from Marx and socialism into his economics that we use predominantly now?
I think Keynesianism was basically warmed over mercantilism, which was, I guess, a sort of a form of fascism. It was a set of government policies that would primarily benefit businesses at the expense of consumers. That's what mercantilism was in a nutshell. And a lot of Keynesianism is just warmed over mercantilism. Although Keynes himself, in the German edition of his famous book, The General Theory, said that his system would work best in a totalitarian society because of all the time lags involved. The government is going to tinker with fiscal policy and monetary policy. It takes a lot of time for Congress to act, and then you have time lags in the economy after a tax cut or a tax increase or a spending increase. And so if you had a dictatorship, the dictator could do it today, Keynes said. And and he was sort of a totalitarian minded central planner. And after all, the 1930s was the era of socialism and central planning, government planning. Was seen as the answer to everything by a lot of intellectuals. And Keynesianism was sort of our version of central planning.
Yeah, Tom, it seems that Keynes and a lot of politicians are in favor of Marx's labor theory of value. So it seems, they want to force wages higher and higher. But, when they try to do that, either there's more investments made by businesses in automation and robots, or the business just shuts down, or it stops making investments into capital goods and expanding the business.
Yeah, they don't understand that the one thing that boosts wages fastest is productivity increases, of the workforce. And what increases that faster than anything is capital and technology. And these are investments that are made by businesses. When businesses purchase new capital and new technology, and their workers, their employees use it, their employees become much more valuable if it's a successful technology. And so the employers have to compete for those workers to keep them there working with their new technology, and they have to offer them more money to have them working for them instead of working for somebody else. And so when the government overtaxes and overregulates businesses, they're killing the goose that lays the golden egg, literally, by reducing the means of capital investment and investment in technology. And that's the main driver of higher wages in the long run, in addition to the skill, the increased skill and education of the workforce itself.
I have one more question before we go. It's about healthcare. Obviously in the United States, the costs of this thing are just out of control. Obamacare has been implemented. The costs were rising before that. With Obamacare now, the costs are just, I've heard stories from friends that their bills are doubling and tripling in the last year or two. It's just insane. Do you think we're headed toward, do you think Obamacare was designed, maybe destined to fail? So eventually Hillary Clinton or whoever else comes after her, who's basically a socialist, can get past, the European type of universal healthcare system?
Well, yes, it was designed to try to drive the private insurance market into complete bankruptcy, and by forcing them to take on people with pre-existing conditions. That's not insurance. That's just forcing insurance companies to pay for hospital bills. And so I think that was always the objective, was to drive the private insurers out of the market altogether, or as much as possible anyway, so that a future Hillary or somebody can say, well, we need single-payer healthcare. And when the government is a single-payer, then you've got full-blown socialized medicine, which has been a debacle all over the world. You create terrible shortages. People die waiting in line for heart surgery and cancer treatment and things like that in Canada and England and anywhere else where you have socialized medicine. And I devote a chapter of my book, The Problem with Socialism, to socialized medicine.
Yeah, very good. And it seems that Hillary Clinton in the past has been an advocate for healthcare rationing. You know, she's tried to stick, even when she was a senator, she was trying to, and just the first lady with Bill Clinton, she was trying to sneak healthcare rationing into congressional bills and things like that. So she's wanted this for a while. You know, unfortunately, I think the costs are just going to continue to escalate. One thing about, you know, the European healthcare system, especially in England, is the costs. People think the costs here in the U.S. are bad. The costs just escalate higher and higher every year with more government intervention.
They're just hidden. It's not free. It's paid for by taxes, and they pay a lot more for a lot lower quality healthcare than we have here. That's why, you know, no one goes to England or Canada for healthcare. People from Canada and England come here, although they're not going to be coming here as much anymore thanks to Obamacare, which is you know, turning our healthcare system into their bad system.
So you agree with Mises then that inflation is 100% government created?
Well, sure. You know, the Fed, you know, the Fed was created in the year 1913, and the value of the dollar was pretty much stable from the time of the Constitutional Convention until 1913. There were some ups and downs, but it was pretty much the currency was pretty much the same value over all that period of time. But now, if you go from 1913 to today, the dollar is worth less than 5 cents of what it was in the year 1913, even though the Fed claims that its responsibility is price stability.
Yeah, and the I don't know if you've seen this, but the ECB has been making propaganda economic cartoons about the evil inflation monster and the evil deflation monster, and how they have to keep the inflation rate at 2%. It's just really funny with these Keynesian aggregates, how, you know, they're trying for an inflation target. We know on Main Street that the real inflation numbers are much higher, especially when you add in the cost that they subtract, you know, with food and rent and healthcare and all these other expenses that just seem to be getting out of control nowadays.
Yeah, I think if you look at, there's a website, shadowstats.com, that takes a look at this, and it would lead you to believe that real inflation is a lot higher than what the government claims it is, yeah, to be sure. And I'm not surprised they lie about that. They lie about the unemployment rate too. If we use the same way of measuring unemployment that we did during the Reagan administration, the official rate would be 2 to 3 times higher than what the government tells us it is today.
Yeah, I agree. But it's just unbelievable what the government can get away with. I mean, so many Americans, either they're totally brainwashed still and they believe in the system and they think Hillary Clinton can actually get change, or they don't care.
Yeah, they're rationally ignorant, as I said earlier.
Okay, Thomas. Well, if our listeners want to buy your book, your new book, The Problem with Socialism, or if they want to buy your other great books, I've watched your great lectures about Abraham Lincoln too, and have found them intriguing. How do they do so?
Amazon.com would be the easiest place, barnesandnoble.com, any of the websites that sell books, or any bookstore should have it. It's published by Regnery Publishing.
Will you also have the book out on audiobook soon?
Yeah, I think it should already be out on Amazon, that you can buy an audio version of it.
Excellent. My listeners love audiobooks. Well, thank you for your time, Thomas, and I'd like to have you back on in the future again to talk about markets and socialism.
Sure, my pleasure. Thanks for having me on the show, and have a great day, Jason.